It was 12 o'clock, so I think I'm going to get us started right on the dot. I want to welcome everybody to today's OLLI Brown Bag presentation. If you guys have any questions throughout the presentation, we urge you to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask, or you can also put them in the chat. Just you're welcome to ask your questions. So firstly, I want to thank our friends of OLLI for making these presentations possible. Their support and their encouragement really helps us bring these really interesting presentations to you every Monday. I do want to mention that our deadline to register for classes, we recommend registering no later than 3 days before. Sometimes we have Saturday classes, and if people register on Friday nights, it's a little bit difficult to get everybody the link that they need. So we ask that you register as soon as possible. I also want to mention that the library at HSU is now open for OLLI members. So if you are a current OLLI member or you're looking to be one, you now have access to the library and a few other things on campus, like free transportation using the buses. So our OLLI membership is an investment in our program, and it helps us run our programs and keep the vibrant community alive. I do want to mention that our cycle is ending soon. So if you're thinking about joining, I recommend waiting till the next cycle starts in June or July. So keep an eye out for that.
July.
Thank you, Jane. We have our membership numbers here. We're still trying to increase them. So if you have a friend or somebody who's interested in either teaching or taking a few classes, I recommend, we recommend that you put a good word for us. Lastly, I want to acknowledge that Cal Poly is on the land of the Wiyot people, which is the ancestral territory of the Wiyot tribe, the Bear River Rancheria, and the Blue Lake Rancheria. Arcata also has native names, and these still carry a lot of meaning to the people who live here and have lived here for thousands of years. There are important parts of this community and history that we may not all be familiar with, so I encourage us to continue learning about this place and learning of the people who were the first stewards of it. Lastly, I want to thank our volunteers. They help us a lot in keeping things running and helping us improve our program. So if you want to be a volunteer, reach out to us at our email. I think I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Jane so she can introduce our presenter today.
And I'm very happy to welcome you all who are attending this, and to welcome David Loya, who is Director of Community Development for the City of Arcata. Community Development oversees planning, housing, and economic development. The city's housing programs include assisting private developers and nonprofits with affordable housing projects, collaborating with the county and the local continuum of care to end homelessness, and a range of programs to assist low and moderate income families rent or own homes in Arcata. The City of Arcata had a bold vision for the future in 2000. This vision was embodied in the General Plan 2020. That future is now, and we now need to plan for the next 20-year vision for our community. The city is engaged in planning for growth and development that honors the community values of agricultural, environmental, and forest preservation, sustainability, social and environmental justice, racial equity, vibrancy in the arts, the economy, and our shared community spaces, and a commitment to a high quality of life for all who live, work, and play in Arcata. This work is the framework for how Arcata grows on its own terms through 2045. It's all yours, David.
All right, thank you, Jane. Thanks for that great introduction. Good afternoon, all, and I'm so glad to see you all here. Many new faces, and happy to meet you all, as well as several folks in the room who could probably give this presentation themselves at this point. So I'm really happy to share with you some of the work that we're doing in the city of Arcata right now. I've got a PowerPoint presentation I'll share with you to walk through some of the material. My primary objective is to just introduce you to why we're doing what we're doing and what we're doing, and really to solicit feedback and input. Many of you may live in Arcata, many of you may not. but I do think that regardless of where you live in Humboldt County, this work is valuable. This work is relevant, and your input on this work is encouraged. So that I'll just jump in. I am not going to be able to see the chat. I'll leave space for for folks to jump in. During one of those pauses, feel free to unmute and ask a question or make a comment. And then I believe somebody's going to be monitoring the chat for me, and so your questions that you put in chat will be asked during those pauses as well. Okay. Share my screen here. All right, full screen mode. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today is sort of the culmination of the planning work that we've done over the last couple of years to try and address, primarily housing crisis, but also, how we're going to plan to grow in many different areas as well. This is work that the City of Arcata has taken on along with its partners Plan West, who it hired to conduct the work, as well as some consultants, including GHD. So I'm just going to start super macro. It's kind of interesting. I've been reading a lot lately on, futurists who think that we need to explore other planets because we're going to, ultimately use this one up. That's shocking to me. We have one planet. We should be focused on making sure that we can live on this planet for the long haul. It's a beautiful place, and the place that we live in is probably one of the most beautiful places on it. And I wanted to acknowledge and thank also the OLLI for acknowledging that we are on Wiyot land. The ancestral lands of Arcata are smack in the middle of Wiyot territory, and that we have come to love this place as well. And so, looking at this aerial image of Arcata, you can see McKinleyville in the background there. Obviously, one of the things that's important to this area, and has been through its entire development, is the green spaces around our cities. If it weren't, we would probably have developed out into those green spaces. And there were periods in our history when that exactly was the plan. And so we've refocused. And there's lots to appreciate about that refocus. The city's plaza is an important feature. Many people point to this as an important way that we build community, by having a central location to have a focus for the community, cultural elements to the community. But there's lots to love about Arcata. We have beautiful rainbows. We have lots of recreational opportunities. Great craft businesses, the cultural events here, we all love them, and nature is one of the things that really brings us all together. We've done amazing things with, our wastewater treatment system. We're world renowned. We've been cutting edge for a long time. And of course, Cal Poly is an important element, both to, cultural aspects of our community, as well as, the economy. And all of that focuses down, as many other industries do, on housing. In order to support all of those great needs, we need to make sure that there's adequate, safe, affordable housing for our community. So that's kind of where we started with this, this plan, this gateway area plan that we're working on, and the update to the general plan that we're working on, sort of recognizing those core values that bring us all together. I'm going to walk through just a few of the historical items that we looked at. We're developing our housing element and trying to really focus on what this strategic infill redevelopment program, which houses all of these efforts, looked like, just so we have a grounding that we can work from together. The first was a report that the state put out in 2018, projecting that by 2025, they would need 1.8 million additional units, but they only expected to produce about 45% of that. And so the state was looking at, the impending housing crisis as a high priority. And it's taken actions since that time to continuously sort of take the local control away. It's implementing new laws and regulations that take local control away and give that local control to anyone, your neighbor, developer, anyone who will build housing to try and meet these massive shortfalls. The City of Arcata has done pretty well in the last several housing element cycles. We've produced about 70% of what's called our regional housing needs allocation. So the state has said, we think you ought to plan for this much growth, and we've done about 70% of it, which means that, while we are falling short, we are doing much better than the state as a whole. In our last housing element cycle, the housing element is a document that's adopted throughout our general plan that says how we're going to meet this regional housing needs that the state says we need to do. We have looked at all of the parcels. Here's a map of the City of Arcata just highlighting the parcels. And the red ones are the parcels that are zone residential that the state allowed us to include in our housing element. Looking at all of those, we still came up with 211 units short if we built out everything we could possibly build out in the City of Arcata over the next 8 years. And so the state said, well, you need to develop a plan to meet that unmet need. And that was sort of the impetus for some of these planning efforts. Now, when we're planning, some folks have said to me, well, why don't we just plan for that 211 units? Why are we planning for so much growth in the City of Arcata? The housing element cycle is an 8-year cycle. We're planning on a 20-year cycle with the general plan updates. And in fact, we need to set ourselves up so that we don't just get through one cycle and then we have to do this whole planning effort all over again, or one general plan cycle and we have to do the whole planning effort again. And so really we're setting the framework for how does the City of Arcata accommodate growth for at least the next 20 years and probably beyond that. See, there are a couple of questions in the chat maybe. By when do we need to meet the 1,000 plus units? So again, the housing element cycle runs through 2027. I hope that answered that question. And that's when the 610 units would need to be met. So what does all this mean? The fact that we're not producing as much housing as maybe we need, that we don't have enough units to meet our future needs. One metric of that we've looked at is rent affordability. And so this is from our 2018 housing element, looking at what proportion of renters in different income categories are overpaying for rent. This is a striking statistic for me because not only are nearly 100% of folks who are considered extremely low income, their households are considered extremely low income, overpaying for rent, which you might anticipate, but almost 70% of moderate income households, so median income households, 70% of them are overpaying for rent. That's a challenge that only gets worse as we fall further and further behind housing production. So if we're only meeting 70% of our housing needs and the housing costs are constantly going up over time, which indicates that we haven't produced enough supply to meet that demand, we put forward to the community in our housing element, what should we do? We talked about infill development. Infill development is essentially taking space inside your city boundaries that are either vacant or underutilized, and then building in those spaces at higher densities. We talked with the community about greenfield expansion. Here's in red the City of Arcata boundary as it stands now. There's lots of ag lands to the west that could be incorporated into the city boundary, and then we could replicate development there. So that greenfield expansion was another alternative. And then many folks in the community said, we don't really want to do anything. We like Arcata the way it is now, and we don't want it to change. So those were kind of the options that were on the table. Well, zooming back out a little bit and thinking about this concept of what happens if we do nothing. Well, if we do nothing in the city, we put development pressure elsewhere. I kind of liken it to, maybe a slightly deflated balloon. You can squeeze in one area and compress it, but it's going to, increase the pressure elsewhere in that balloon. The housing market is no different. Our area is attractive for many reasons. We have, climate change. that is causing people to leave areas that are of more immediate impact and danger, for instance, fire danger. We have economic refugees. I've talked to many people over the past 2 years who moved here from places like LA, Sacramento, San Francisco, Bay Area, and were able to cash out of their house in that area and buy a house in this area, cash as a cash transaction. So we have climate change, economic change. We have Cal Poly, that's a new significant driver, an uptick in the driver that HSU already was. So there's lots of pressures that are driving, and where we plan for where this growth and development should occur is really going to impact, as I've mentioned, what happens within the city of Arcata, but also what happens within the county as a whole. Right now, I think we all appreciate the green landscape, on the hill slopes. Those could become, pockmarked, if you will, with housing development based on the county zoning. So the conversation we had with the council was, either greenfield expansion, most likely, in this area right here near Sun Valley, or densification within the city boundaries. And ultimately, the city of Arcata city council said, look, we want to pick these areas where we can upzone internally before we have to start looking externally. We had several opportunity zones in our housing element, and we are currently working on the first of those opportunity zones, the Gateway Area Plan. The primary outcomes that we were looking for, we kind of wanted it all. We want to see mixed use. We want to see, residential mixed with commercial, residential mixed with maybe light industrial. We want to see mixed income. We want one building to not define the income. When you walk out of the lobby of that building, we don't want to be able to tell what your income level is. Right now, we've done really good job working with our housing partners at building affordable housing for people earning 80% area median income or less. We'd like those mixed income buildings so that you can't tell what that person's income is. We also want to focus on multi-generational. A lot of the housing production we've gotten in Arcata recently has been, one bedroom or even studio to try and target the student market. We want to be able to build for all of the different markets of folks that want to live in Arcata: small families, large families, higher income people, and we don't have that right now. These are some of the other focuses. Alternative transportation. We wanted to make sure there are ownership opportunities. And really, one of the core ingredients is that we wanted this to be community designed. We went through recent housing approval process with a project, and we really heard that loud and clear from the community. So that's what we're trying to address with this plan. The Gateway Area Plan draft was released in December of last year, so we've had a couple of months to look at it. It was one of the first opportunity zones that we are focusing on for high density infill development that meets all these objectives. Just for orientation, there's the plaza, the Creamery building, and we're looking at, between Samoa, K Street, and Q Street, essentially an old industrial sites that can be re-envisioned. So I'm not going to read the vision statement here. I'm going to hold it up here for a moment so that you can, if you wish to, but really, we started with this vision, and the primary purpose is to grow opportunity and build community equitably. That's what we hope to accomplish with this plan. Okay, so how do we do that? We identified a couple of different sub-districts, if you will, within this gateway area, focusing on different opportunities. Some, like the Gateway Corridor, are going to be more oriented towards commercial, right along the K Street corridor. Some, like the Gateway Barrel District, will have higher densities that are afforded to it because there's a larger land base and more vacancy to play with. But we also want to make sure that we're not just focusing on housing development or density. These different districts would have different levels of density allowable to them. But we also want to make sure that the building heights require that they provide community amenities as well. So a lot of folks have looked at this and said, oh my gosh, you're giving this great handout to the developers. What's this all about? Are you creating this plan in the smoky back rooms, just giving a handout to developers? And the answer is no. We really are focusing on the amenities that the community wants to see, such as public outdoor open space, alternative transportation, energy and sustainability, and affordable housing. This is just a short list. There's all kinds of planning packed into this plan for open space, trails, recreational amenities that'll be baked into the private facilities. We'll also be working through a planning effort that establishes setbacks, appropriate setbacks for the stature and size of the buildings. And I'll talk a little bit more about what the form-based code or community design looks like in just a moment. But the idea here isn't just cram as much density into one place as you possibly can. The idea here is master plan this area so that we don't just get the highest density that the code will possibly allow. That's what's actually happening in our current code, and we're trying to avoid that and make sure that we have well-integrated communities. So what is this community benefits program? Basically, if you come in for a planning or a permit for new development, there's two pathways. One is a planning permit pathway where you would go to a hearing with the Planning Commission, and then the Planning Commission would authorize conditions of approval, and those conditions of approval are similar to community benefits, except they're limited in scope. Community benefits program allows us as a community to say we really want things X, Y, and Z. Maybe it's a new park in this area, or maybe it's a better provision for alternative transportation, or maybe it's bus pass program for all of the people that live and work inside the building. Those things are typically beyond the scope of a traditional condition of approval, and so this community benefits program can go above and beyond the standard conditions and above and beyond the standards that you would see in building code or typical planning code. So when a project comes through, they could either go through the planning process, or they can meet the form-based code, the community design code, and provide these community benefits. And then they would be able to go through a streamlined process for approval. What are the community benefits? Well, there's a whole range of them. This is just a subsection of different amenities within housing creation. We'd establish these within each of the different priority areas, whether it's affordable housing or sustainable building design, all electrification, these kinds of things, to identify what the community has said. These are our values. This is how we implement those values. Projects would then come in and be able to select from these different packages of community amenities, and that would get them on the track for the streamlined approval. I'm going to pause for just a second. Looks like there's maybe a couple of questions.
Yeah, thanks. There are, David. Starting with the first question was, what do you consider overpaying for rent? Is it greater than 50% of income?
That's a really great question. Typically this is a census definition, and it's either 30 or 33% of your income is what's traditionally considered what a household should budget towards its income. I'm sorry, towards its rent. And so paying more than 33% would be considered overpaying. Some folks are paying as much as 50% of their income, especially if you get down into the lower income categories, which is just shocking to think about. Isn't the location first in line for sea level rise? I've got a slide to that, so if I can hold on that question and answer that. But no, the big picture answer is this is actually a plan to help us adapt to sea level rise. Can buildings be less stories so tall can be dehumanizing? I haven't gotten to the building elevation and form-based code fully, but the idea would be that yes, these buildings, regardless of how tall they are, need to fit within a human scale. And so if you think about the Creamery building, for example, if you were standing next to the Creamery building, you probably don't see anything out of the ordinary. The Creamery building has 2 towers associated with it that are 5 stories tall. And so the design of the Creamery building ameliorates the fact that it's 5 stories tall. And so through design, we would ensure that the streetscapes, the human centered design and the feel of the neighborhood still felt really Arcata. And the way that we're going to ensure that is by going through this community design process. Fire and public safety adaptation, question. So I assume the question is something along the lines of, are we making sure that there's adequate infrastructure, including things like services for fire and public safety? And the answer is absolutely. We have to scale those services, those public services, with the scale of our community. And so they would, and there's a couple of different funding mechanisms for how that gets done. And then one more, how are we accommodating state solar requirements for new housing? Those are building code requirements. And in fact, we would be including community amenities that would allow folks to go above and beyond what the building code requires, including concepts such as having block-based microgrids where groups of housing units or groups of buildings could coordinate together for solar access and then battery storage to provide for those smaller block level microgrids. So there's a lot of really creative ideas on the horizon. Okay, I see more questions are coming in. I'm going to jump to the next couple of slides. I do address wastewater treatment and other issues in a minute. So I know your first question is, what's a form-based code? That was right on the top of your mind. Let me explain this a little bit, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what this plan will result in. Because right now, the plan that we have before us doesn't give a lot of detail. It's the policy plan, and the detail is left to the code. And so we haven't quite got the code built yet. So let me explain what a form-based code is. Traditional zoning essentially establishes real broad parameters, and then it leaves the determination around what any individual project looks like to a project by project approval process. And so you might have a big box that tells you what's the total density, how big the building can be, what the setbacks would be, but we have no idea as a community what the design is going to look like or how that's going to interact with the public sphere. These are decided on a broad brush stroke, large scale, area wide decision. And so when the decision makers are faced with an individual project, they're looking to these conventional zoning codes and saying, well, it meets that code, so we need to approve it. And so it doesn't give the public or the developer a whole lot of confidence going into the process, what the outcomes will be. There are some communities who have adopted zoning design guidelines, which go into a little bit more detail than just conventional zoning. They might tell you, a little bit about the patterning, surface articulation, frequency of openings, but it doesn't really design out the community. You really have kind of a sense for what the streetscape is going to look like, but you don't really have a sense for much else than that. In this type of zoning, there's not necessarily a limitation on maximum buildings, for example, that would fit within this block pattern. With a form-based code, you could actually go into a little bit deeper detail. This community design could say, hey, within this footprint, we want to see buildings of no more than 3 stories. If you're going to have, in this zoning district, there is provision for 4 stories on this one frontage. And even though 5 stories is the maximum in this block area, you can only have one 5-story building, within 300 feet of each other, something to that effect. And so that you can get into a much more granular detail about what the community is going to look like in the future. When you've gone through this process, the idea being that someone who comes in and says, well, yes, I've given you privacy for planters for privacy. I've met the stoops. I get the tall first floor with the transparency. All the things that you said you wanted as a community. I'm giving that to you, as well as the community amenities. That's what would get them into a streamlined permit process, because we can see that they've met that form-based code. So that's kind of what this process allows for in its draft form. Okay, don't focus too much on these images. These are the ones that are in the code right now as placeholders. These are just examples of what buildings could look like on the upper end. We anticipate through this process potentially replacing these with buildings that fit more with what the community vision is. But the idea is that through this community design process, you're giving the community certainty about what the built environment will look like in the future so that you don't have to come together with your neighbors and mobilize a big effort on a project by project basis when they're developing out the vacant lot next door to yours. You already know, you've already participated, you've already provided your input, you know what was adopted, you know what to expect. That would provide a comprehensive plan throughout the entire area instead of a project by project level review that doesn't articulate real well with the rest of the master plan. And then it also would provide through this process for project streamlining, as long as you met the form-based code, provide the community amenities. Okay, so to some of your answers, what about climate change? Or some of your questions, what about climate change, tsunamis, infrastructure, all of these questions? We can get into these in more detail on a one-off basis. This plan has addressed all of those, and we will continue to address them and refine them and further have discussions about them. But let me just touch on a few. With climate change, and this is from sea level rise NOAA mapper. This, without getting too technical into the detail, is called the bathtub model. Just fills up to a certain elevation. It doesn't consider whether or not you do anything to prevent that happening. With 9 feet of sea level rise, which is significantly more sea level rise than is likely to happen in the next 100 years, but with 9 feet of sea level rise, there are some areas within the lower parts of the plan area that are impacted. Frankly, without the levees that are in place currently today, some of these areas would be impacted as well. And we've all seen, some heavy weather scenarios where there's flooding, upstream flooding and flooding within our community. And so we do definitely need to make sure that we're designing and accommodating, for flooding, both from sea level rise and from, storm events. This plan has addressed that, I believe, and we will continue to address that. The question about let's see, there's a question here about sea level rise. Arcata sewage treatment marsh are first in line to be displaced by sea level rise. Shouldn't we be figuring the eventual relocation of the area for the sewage treatment before going forth with the gateway? So I think the way that I take the question is, shouldn't we have planned out where our treatment plant will be in 40 or 50 years before we plan for make this plan? And maybe part of the question, Lori, if you want to clarify, is maybe the new treatment plant could go somewhere in this area. And I guess the response is that we are going to be studying in the EIR, the environmental impact report for this gateway area plan. We are going to study those issues. I think most of the professionals that I talk to in the field believe that wastewater treatment, can be managed in many different ways. There was a plan, in the past for, basically having a region-wide wastewater treatment plant that would then discharge into an ocean outfall, and so that's an alternative. There are also some professionals who are telling me that wastewater treatment in general is going to decentralize in the future, and so I think there are lots of options on the table. Whether you move the plant to accommodate that, move the plant into an area that you would be able to accommodate future growth and development, and moving those traditional treatment plants closer, I think that's definitely a conversation the community should have. There are also some concerns about, well, is this in the tsunami zone? And if I could get my slides to advance. The state is in the process of updating its tsunami zone maps to be a little more credible. You can see the faded aerial image of the gateway area, and in yellow you can see the tsunami inundation zone. And so it's largely outside that tsunami inundation zone, except where the creeks are daylighted here. And then there's, lots of questions about, other infrastructure, water, wastewater, the roads, all of these that we will need to have growth and development into the future. Just as we built them in the past, we will continue to do so incrementally into the future. It gets a little difficult for us to envision all of this happening at once because it won't, but it's overwhelming to think about it as if it's going to happen all at once. I'll point to the Foster Avenue extension that connected Sunset to Alliance as an example where that was planned, more than 20 years ago. And it took about 20 years of planning, design, and securing the funds to be able to build it out. If we hadn't planned it 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been built. And so part of what we're trying to do here is to look forward into the future and design a plan that meets what we believe will be our challenges into the future, as well as those that we have currently. Tall buildings create more shade in an already sun-challenged area. How do you approach that? Yeah, that's a great question. And access to solar access has been, a big topic on everyone's minds. I don't want anyone to walk away from this thinking that there's never going to be a building that shades another building in the future. And in fact, if you walk around town, you can tell the sunny side of the street from the shady side of the street. Right now, we just entered the springtime. We're just, at the point where the sun is starting to, raise in latitude in the sky. And so we're getting sunnier days, longer days, higher sun days. And I guess to answer this question, I would just put forward a challenge to you is to, go walk around at different times of day throughout town, different sized buildings, and see how far the shadows cast. That gives you an idea about what we need to do with the design to ensure that we don't have significant negative impacts on current and future residents because we didn't plan for it. So definitely planning for solar access. So the key is having a really detailed code that reflects the city's vision. How do we make sure that we address all the pertinent details so nothing slips through? That's definitely going to be a community process. We're going to take into consideration all of the concerns that we've been hearing, through this public engagement process that we've been going through, and hope to integrate those into our planning process for the design. Certainly the design could be modified in the future as well if we find that we haven't quite hit the mark. Okay, so the next question, how do I get involved? So I just want to run you through real quick because many of you, this may be the first time you've heard of it, you're interested, you want to learn more, you want to participate, you want to have your voice heard. If you go to our city's website, cityofarcata.org, the e-notification sign up is on the upper left-hand side of this bar here. It'll take you to a page that looks like this. And if you sign up for the long-range planning and community visioning, you'll get notifications about opportunities to engage either at the staff level or at the decision maker level, as well as notices around when we upload information to this page, Strategic Infill Redevelopment Program. If you Google SIRP, S-I-R-P, and Arcata, this will be your top hit. And this is where we're housing information about the plan, engagements, frequently asked questions. All of the content information that you could find of interest to this plan is housed on this page. And so I encourage you to check that out. And that is pretty much what I had planned for you today. It's a pretty high level dive into the document. I know there may be some additional questions and I'd be happy to address those. I have many other slide decks that have specifics on particulars if you're interested in bringing those up. Or I'd appreciate just an open conversation if you're interested in that. Here's my contact information. Feel free to jot it down and reach out to me if you don't feel comfortable in the public forum. And thank you. looking forward to the next time when I can do this in person with you all as well.
Do you see
Like
that?
a couple of questions are popping up.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw, is it, Carolyn asked, when do you see this happening?
Okay, so maybe clarify what I'm by what is this? The plan adoption or the build out? Like when are we going to start seeing things built?
Carolyn, are you still in the room? Do you want to clarify? Build out.
Build out. Okay, so that's what I thought. So I'll give just a couple of analogies because I can't really predict that with any kind of certainty. For the last 20 years, 20 plus years, it's been legal to build a 4-story building right in the core downtown area and surrounding blocks. That's what our code currently allows for. You can build right up to the back of Walk. You build 4 stories tall. And how many have we seen built in the last 20 years? Approximately 3. We have 2 3-story buildings and 1 4-story building that's been built. And so, are the market forces there? Maybe, should we, plan for market forces when they get there? Yeah, I definitely think so. Another way to look at this is that the city of Arcata, I showed you a slide earlier that showed, all the little red parcels, and we have, a gap of 211. All those little red parcels, for the most part, were zoned and planned about 70 years ago. We've been working off the same housing stock for the last 70 years. I kind of liken that to the effort we're doing now. You can there's a figure in the Gateway Area Plan that says, mathematically it's possible that there will be 3,500 units developed in the Gateway Area Plan. Do I think there's going to be 3,500 units in the next 10 years or 20 years? No, I don't think that that's possible. Do I think we'll have 3,500 units there eventually? It's possible. It's conceivable. I mean, this area is a climate refuge, and it will continue to attract people from outside and in other parts of the state. In addition, our population is going to be growing intrinsically. And so it's possible, but I think it's a far off scenario. I think that we are doing multi-generational planning at this point, allowing for growth and development that is far in exceedance of what our actual need is. And so that actual need will dictate the build out. Let's see. When is the detailed code available to review? So in the next month or so, I'd like to be able to get some direction from the council on this framework plan. The Gateway Area Plan is the framework. We've heard a lot about the building elevations. Allowing for 8 stories seems out of character for many people in this community. There's a very small number of people. It used to be about half and half. They're starting to become the minority now who felt like 8 stories wasn't enough, that it didn't go far enough. And so we are likely to go to the council for a recommendation to drop the building heights down in all of those districts and just sort of scale back just a little bit. Once we get that direction, then we can start working on the more detailed code. We don't want to spend our efforts building out the detailed code before we have direction on max building height, because that's one of the key factors. But also you need to recognize that, the shorter the buildings, the less the density, the potential there is for, more development if the market is actually driving it. If the market dictates we're going to have 1,000 units and you're only allowed, 100 units per building, you're going to get 10 buildings, and that's going to be on 10 different properties. If the market dictates that you need 1,000 units and we allow 500 units per building, you're going to get 2 buildings. And so the height is directly correlated with how quickly the area gets built out. Let's see. As a property owner in Arcata, I have concerns about the cost to relocate, rebuild a new sewage treatment plant, especially city taxes on property owners go way up. Can you talk about funding sources and expectation of tax impacts on existing property owners? That's a great point. And I do think that, the wastewater treatment plant relocation or re-envisioning, if it winds up being something more dispersed, is something that I think we're going to need to partner both with our the state agencies that regulate wastewater, probably federal agencies, Arcata is not the only community whose wastewater treatment plant is threatened by sea level rise. And we need to, as a nation, develop solutions that support communities moving those wastewater treatment plants or reimagining what a wastewater treatment plant is. So I think it's going to be a combination of different solutions. Obviously, if you make wastewater treatment so expensive that the community can't afford it, then you're gonna cause blight. You'll start to see people move out of the community because they can't afford the services, leaving behind facilities that they no longer use, that no one else can move into either because it's cost prohibitive. And so all of those things kind of, I guess in my mind, they balance out. I don't have the specific answer for you today, but I can tell you that we will work towards solutions that balance those, the feasibility of moving that plant. CPH has more urgent needs and legal authority than City of Arcata, where there'll be parallel development tracks for each. I'm not quite sure I understand the question, and I apologize. Maybe it's the acronym, but
Cal Poly Humboldt has more urgent needs.
so, okay, are you suggesting that I'm still, is this asking like Cal Poly is going to need to develop because they're bringing students here. And so, and they have a legal authority that's separate from the city in order to build those units. So are there parallel development tracks? That's how I'm going to answer the question. I'm going to assume that's the question. Cal Poly, I don't want to speak for, but I will say that that what I've seen in the prospectus, they intend to provide a lot of housing, both within Arcata and also in Eureka and McKinleyville primarily. And I think that I've also heard from many presentations that they've made that they're anticipating there's going to be a contingent of their growth that actually is remote into the university, that they'll have groups of folks that are outside the community that are remoting in. And so I don't know, we have some estimates right now that we're working on to try and gauge the impact of Cal Poly, but I do definitely think that the state can provide for its own development without asking the city. And in fact, there's a recent example. The community didn't want to see the Craftsman's Mall project, the Village project, built, especially in the way that it was envisioned. And through the public engagement process on that, the open public process that that project went through, it was effectively ended. It was effectively shut down. And Cal Poly came back and bought the property, and now they're basically building out the Village version 1.0 that the community said it didn't want. And so that is a possibility, I guess I will say to that. Gateway residents won't give up their cars. Isn't this a concern for safety on our local roads and neighborhoods, not designed for the volume of cars? This is a really complex topic. What I will say to you is this. Let's imagine that we don't grow a stitch between now and 2030 when Cal Poly anticipates being fully built out, just by taking one example. If the students and faculty can't live in Arcata, then they live outside of Arcata. And if the students and faculty are coming to Arcata because that's where Cal Poly is, then we have the same car problem. In fact, we have a problem that we don't have control over at that point because we haven't provided for any housing in the area. Parking is a hot button issue for folks. I totally get it. I was just looking at our 2007 study for housing in the downtown, where there's a huge perceived problem. In fact, the quote for the week I heard from recently is that we have a parking perception problem, parking inconvenience problem, but we have a housing crisis. We will never have a parking crisis. And so we need to work on that housing crisis. I fully acknowledge that not everyone is going to be able to have a car-free lifestyle, and that isn't the point. That's not what this plan calls for. It doesn't disallow cars. What it does is emphasizes alternative transportation. We will never turn the corner if we don't plan and invest in alternative transportation. If we accept that we will never get there, and so we only ever build out infrastructure for cars, we will never get there. That's how that works. You don't plan for it, you don't build it, you don't get there. And so what this plan does is sets out a vision that allows us a pathway to get there. Can I promise you we'll get there? No. What I can promise you is that there's going to be an infrastructure that will allow us to plot a pathway forward. This plan allows for bus passes within buildings so that your employees and your residents can fund the buses, whether they actually use them or not. That's a different matter. At current headways, you're probably not going to see a lot of early adoption. But if we can fund the buses to the point where they have high headways and they're convenient, and people can actually get around the county on them to places they need to go, then people might decide to jump on a bus instead of taking their one-off car. There's plans for car share within these projects so that you could have some percentage of the number of cars in units that people within that unit all can use that car share. And so if you want to run up to Trinidad for a couple of hours and go to Moonstone, that's one of the biggest concerns I've heard. Well, people are going to go to Moonstone. They're going to go to Strawberry Rock. Yeah, take one of your car shares, run up there real quick and come back. Then you don't have to own the car. Interesting note that I took on recently was that in Valley West, one of the most disconnected sections of Arcata in terms of alternative transportation, there's something like 14% of households that have only one vehicle and 7% of households that have no vehicle. That's in Valley West. So, can it be done? I think so. Yeah, so we have to be bold and think through those, I think, together as a community and figure out what the right balance is for alternative transportation. But I do think that, simply saying that it'll never happen is probably the wrong approach for us. Let's see. I was recently in Berlin where neighborhood buildings were typically 7 stories with courtyards and vegetation trees. They looked very livable. Would it be good to present some possible building design ideas so we would have a better idea of what it would look like? I think that's a really great point, Nancy. And if you want to share some photos with me, I'd love to see those. I do think we can do it right. I think that we can plan our community that accommodates the the density that we probably have a moral obligation to plan for, as well as all of the quality of life elements that make living in Arcata great. See, Cal Poly plans adding substantial residential units. Don't those units also count towards the city's required number of units? Interestingly, no, we don't get to count those on our arena for our housing element. So, but what it does do, I mean, even though we don't get to count that towards our housing production, what it does do is helps in reality, out in the real world. We can't put it on a form, but it helps in the real world. And I applaud Cal Poly's efforts to meet their housing needs into the future. And I don't think Cal Poly is a question whether they would create their own wastewater treatment. No, I don't think that's probably feasible for Cal Poly. And what would probably make more sense, because the technology for real dispersed systems isn't quite there yet, it would probably make more sense for Cal Poly to help pay into our system, and I think they're planning on doing that, so that we as a community can service the greater need, the greater good. It's kind of a strange format. I can't wait till we're back in person. You can just shout out your questions.
Julie, do you have a question?
And I have a comment, actually. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you for such a thoughtful project and presentation. But I just want to remind, I have been around so long that when I was a child, the sidewalks in Arcata were made of redwood. So I just bring that up because everything changes. And I'm not going to suggest that you do that, but it's just that we've been through some phases. And when I was a child, cutting down trees to use them for sidewalks was the norm. that was not considered wasteful or environmentally unsound. And so throughout all the years, now we have saved agricultural lands because of the marsh project. We've saved forest lands because of the forest protections. And so it's time now, of course, to find housing for people so that people can be in a community that has these other virtues. So I'm just really grateful to you. And I would add, I do hope you'll emphasize the pedestrian aspect and the car usage limitations. It would be good for all of us to do some research. The last time I looked, the cost of a new car is about the same as a mortgage payment. So it's like for people who are thinking they can't afford to buy a home, they need to save up the down payment. It's a little harder now than it was 2 years ago. And the mortgage payments are often, I mean, look at the trucks and things that are $60,000, $70,000 and the fuel that it costs and the insurance. There's a mortgage payment built right into those vehicles. So the people in Valley West are smart by having either no car or one car. Some of the rest of us need to follow that example.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in particular for lower income households in our community, oftentimes they're disproportionately impacted by their vehicle allowance, if you will, and they're not driving around brand new Ford trucks. They're driving around, cars that are, on the verge of breaking down. And so they, instead of, putting that money towards, other family needs, are, putting it into a vehicle because they have to currently in order to get around. So I'm looking forward to a future with more alternative transportation options, and I think there are a lot of entities that are working on this as well regionally. So I do see that in the future.
I have a question, David. I think you ought to explain why visually it will work if you have multi-story buildings, because the upper stories will be set back from the frontage of the lower stories and thus not be visible. That's the analogy to the Creamery District building, because its towers are set back so they don't either shade the street necessarily or they aren't visible from the street. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I think those are the sorts of design considerations that are identified, maybe not emphasized well enough in the plan as it's currently written, but certainly those design elements can help to retain that human feel. I mean, if you're walking on the trail, on L Street in front of the Creamery building, the first thing you notice is that there's vegetation, there's places to sit, there's, kind of a setback before you get to the buildings. Unfortunately, that setback is taken up in parking because it's one of the only spots that the Creamery building has for parking. But, that space could be used for, community space where you might have, a small, small tot lot or, a little hangout place to serve, the pub, where you'd have more people being able to be served, for example. So then that first, 30, 40 feet of the Creamery District property, that could be contributed back to the community and uses that are available to the public. And then you get to, ostensibly, even though there's only one floor inside, there are two-story buildings on the frontage, and it doesn't seem out of place to have 2 stories. You could have those setbacks on the upper floors used for, patios that contributes more, space for people to enjoy once they're inside the building, enjoy some outdoor space. But that also contributes to, ameliorating some of these, impacts of larger buildings being, so oppressive and upfront by pushing them back. Yeah, and I do definitely want to, caution us, trying to imagine a world where you have a 5 or 6 story building that you can't see. You're going to see these things. They're going to cast shadows. There are going to be periods throughout the day when, especially in the winter, when, those shadows are going to encroach on buildings across the street. But we can design them in a way so that that doesn't happen most of the year.
Have you designed or
really
allocated space for these microgrids? Is that going to be part of the zoning requirements? David?
You caught me on shredding day. We've got the shredding truck out there, and it's like 1,000 decibels right outside my window. Apologize if it's noisy for y'all.
Sorry about that. The issue is, are some of these details, like the setbacks on the upper floors, going to be part of the zoning code so they will be enforceable? So you
Yeah,
can
absolutely.
say no.
In fact, what I'm hoping is that at some point we can literally get to the, as I showed in the image. Let me see if I can pull it up right here. Detailed enough design so that we can actually get a sense for what the buildings might look like. Not that we would know that, because there's got to be some flexibility in the actual architectural design. So we're not going to have each building designed out. But my hope is that at least in certain areas, we would have enough resolution on what these buildings would look like, is that we could actually visualize today what the future might look like. And that we would have, all of these details around what makes, a nice community-oriented design already established within those codes, instead of just saying, like our current code does, that you have to have a 10-foot setback, and that's all there is to it. Let's get a little bit more detail in there.
There's another question in the chat.
See, there was,
You see that, David? There's a question in the chat.
L Street plan appears to use the railroad right of way. Is that railroad track no longer protected? That's a great question too. There's a lot in the plan that I would say is outlining our desired future state, our vision as a community. That we don't necessarily have every single step figured out on how to get there. Similar to the Foster extension, we didn't know what all the mechanisms were, all the financial feasibility. We didn't know if there were wetlands in the way. We didn't know anything. There could have been, archaeological, that we didn't know about. There's a lot that you don't know when you set a vision out. And so this is the vision. The railroads, my understanding, the trail authority that's taking over the railroads is sort of in transition right now. What they ultimately do with those, it's uncertain to me at this point. But I do know that we're going through a planning process right now, and if we want to designate that that's what we would see as a future condition, this is the time to do it. And then we could start working on the details with the trail authority, making sure that we're complying with whatever their requirements are to accomplish those goals. And it could be that today it doesn't work, but in 20 years it does work.
Are there any more questions? David, this has been a fantastic presentation. I'm sorry, Ted, you have a question? You want to unmute?
Still muted, Ted.
There you go.
Oh, okay. There have been an awful lot of development programs in various cities all over the country. And I wonder if you have looked at some of these other plans and see how they did it and what the problems were and so on.
Yeah, I think we definitely are trying to look to other communities and learn lessons from them. We've had several examples shared with us by the community, and ultimately, I think one of the things that we're aware of and wish to make sure that we address is that there are examples out there, there are templates, there's guidance, but that ultimately this needs to be a rapidly Arcata plan. We don't do anything, this big. We do it this big all the time in Arcata. And so we're going to make sure that this plan is, all Arcata all the time, all the way. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. We definitely need to look to what other communities have done and learn from their lessons.
Are there any other questions? If not, David, this has been a really, really good presentation. I think it's helped a lot of people understand what's going on. And I
All right,
know
thank you.
David would welcome any comments that you have, and you can send them to him directly at dloya@cityofarcata.org. And he'll be, I'm sure, happy to respond to you. You can also send feedback to the Planning Commission and to City Council, and go to the website and you'll get those addresses. If you send it directly to Karen Dima, she will forward it to Council. Meantime, we really appreciate your spending this time with us, David, and want to let you know that next week we will be having a discussion with Lori Wayburn, who's president of the Pacific Forest Trust, which is involved in protecting forests and putting the forest back into forestry. So thank you so much. David, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jane, and thank you all. It's been great talking with you, and I'm looking forward to the next time, hopefully having an update as to where we're at. I put my contact information in the chat, so if you want to open that and copy that down, feel free to.
Everybody, thanks for being here today.
And don't forget to look at the classes. We have classes ongoing